Before I show how the system works in practice, there's something you need to understand first. You need to understand the body the system is working on. Up until now, this channel has mostly been about structure, how large systems behave, why they operate the way they do, and why outcomes often feel impersonal or blunt. This episode shifts the perspective slightly. It isn't about blame, and it isn't about complaint. It's about baseline. Before going any further, a brief practical note. I'm using an avatar and a voice clone here. For continuity, my physical capacity fluctuates. This is about clarity and consistency, not performance. Now to the substance. When systems deal with disability, they often think in categories: physical, neurological, mental. Those categories are administratively useful, but they're poor tools for understanding lived reality. Two people can share a diagnosis and have radically different lives. Even within the same condition, needs vary widely. Energy, coordination, recovery time, tolerance for stress. Disability is not a checklist. It's an interaction between a body, a mind, and an environment. For this episode, I'm narrowing in on one condition: Friedreich's ataxia. That's because it's the condition I've lived with for all of my life, and that matters. What I'm describing here is not a medical overview. It's not a general explanation. It's lived experience. I'm not speaking for everyone with ataxia. I'm describing how this condition behaves in my body. Friedreich's ataxia is a progressive neurological condition. It affects coordination, balance, muscle control, endurance. It also affects things that are less visible: fatigue, recovery time, the cost of concentration. Movements that look small from the outside often require significant effort. Tasks don't just take time, they take energy, and that energy does not replenish quickly. As the condition progresses, margin disappears. There's less room for error, less tolerance for repetition, less ability to absorb disruption. What that means in practice is that everyday life becomes more deliberate. Planning matters, sequencing matters, rest matters, and the cost of getting something wrong is higher than it appears. This isn't about suffering as an abstract idea. It's about physics. A body with reduced coordination and reduced endurance interacts differently with the world, and that interaction shapes everything else. Another important point: disability rarely exists in isolation. There are secondary effects, complications, adaptations. Some are medical, some practical, some psychological. They don't line up neatly. Trying to separate them cleanly often misses how they actually operate. This is why broad assumptions fail. It's also why simple questions often don't have simple answers. By the time systems encounter someone like me, they're not dealing with a single issue. They're dealing with accumulation of constraints, of workarounds, of limits that have already been negotiated daily. This episode isn't about arguing whether that's fair. It's about establishing reality. Because when systems enter later, healthcare, social care, assessments, funding, they're interacting with this baseline, whether they recognize it or not. So before moving into real-time interactions, emails, calls, decisions, and delays, it's necessary to pause here and understand what daily life actually involves. Not exhaustively, not perfectly, but enough to make what follows intelligible. So that's the baseline. And even that description is incomplete by definition. Not because anything is being withheld, but because much of what shapes daily life here is continuous, overlapping, and difficult to separate. It isn't experienced as a list of problems. It isn't stored in categories. It's simply how life functions. Even with time and quiet, I can't reliably enumerate everything that matters. That limitation alone already explains something important. Alongside Friedreich's ataxia, there are other ongoing factors in my life. Type 1 diabetes is one of them. It isn't the dominant condition. Ataxia sets the outer limits, but diabetes adds constant procedural work inside those limits. Every day involves insulin, a long-acting dose, and insulin with meals. That means judging food, estimating carbohydrates, and making decisions that don't always behave predictably. And it isn't just the decision, it's the physical process. Insulin pens, tiny needles, small caps that have to be screwed on and off each time. Fine motor control matters. If I rush, I drop things. If I'm careless, I stab myself. Each injection produces waste, paper, plastic, used needles. Those needles can't go in the bin. They go into a sharps disposal box. Clinical waste. That box has to be stored and replaced. Insulin has to be kept refrigerated. Supplies have to be managed. None of this happens once. It happens repeatedly, every day, and it all happens inside a body with impaired coordination, limited energy, and very little margin for error. On its own, diabetes is manageable. Inside ataxia, it becomes labor, persistent labor. The same interweaving applies to sleep. Sleep isn't simply poor quality. Because of scoliosis and neurological impairment, my sleep is mechanically disrupted. Changing position at night isn't automatic. I have to wakefully reposition deliberately, often using my hands and the structure of the bed to move my legs and body. That happens repeatedly. There's also sensory uncertainty, not always being sure whether something feels wrong because it is wrong, or because sensation itself is distorted. So sleep doesn't reset my system. It only partially restores it. Fatigue accumulates. Then there are falls, not dramatic, not constant, but frequent enough to shape my daily decisions. When a fall happens, the fall itself is rarely the main issue. The problem is what follows. Being on the floor, working out whether it's possible to get up, trying to maneuver into a position where a grab rail or solid surface can be reached. That can involve dragging knees or ankles across the floor. Scraping, bruising, it takes time, it takes effort, and it's exhausting. There are bladder and continence issues as well. I'm not going into detail here. What matters is that they interact with sleep, fatigue, and falls, and that they affect planning and dignity. And there are other factors I haven't named yet. Some are part of ataxia itself, some are secondary conditions, some are consequences, some are simply how this particular body behaves. Trying to separate them cleanly often misses the reality. From the outside, none of this is visible. Sitting in a wheelchair, talking normally, appearing composed, there's very little to signal the full complexity underneath. And that matters, because when people enter this situation professionally, they don't always enter it with malicious intent. But intent isn't the main issue. This kind of work requires thought and judgment. Some people do that well. Others default to forms, categories, and ticking boxes. And while the system encourages that behavior, it doesn't excuse it. Understanding complex human situations is not incidental to these roles. It is the job. When people rely entirely on templates and procedures, they stop seeing the person in front of them as a whole. They interact with fragments, and fragments are easier to dismiss. That's poor practice, and in systems like this, poor practice has consequences, because the complexity doesn't disappear, just because it wasn't properly engaged with. That's the baseline. From here, the next step is to watch how I experience a system that has lost its way through oversimplification. In my case, it hasn't worked well, and it's still not working. That's what I'll move into next.